All of the assault legends are meant to be aggressive. To what extent? Well, that will vary depending on each one. In this video, I'm going to break down the playstyle of the assault class as a whole, but also get into specifics for each legend. So let's get into it. Now, all of these legends center around dealing some form of damage with their tactical abilities in one way or another. But at the same time, and maybe even more importantly, I like to think about how the legend's tactical centers around hindering an aspect of their opponent. With Bangalore, it's going to be the enemy's vision. Maggie, their cover. Ballistic, their weapon. Ash, their movement, and Fuse, well, Fuse just wants to blow things up, enemies included. Now, their ultimate is where things will vary more widely, and part of this is due to when the legend was released, what Apex has decided they want to add into their game, and hoping that it fits into their core gameplay. And while that might be up for debate with some legends, the assault class is pretty well known to have core patterns that revolve around using their abilities to force opponents to make combat decisions that play to their advantage, opening them up for an assault. Now, my goal for this video is to make sure that this information not only applies to the brand new player, but also the experienced player trying to broaden their playstyle in Apex. Now, all legends in the assault class have access to assault bins. This is their class perk, and this is going to be a secret compartment of weapon supply bins that are specifically marked as the assault bin. It's going to contain 4 smart loot attachments for you or your team's current loadout. 1 loot slot is going to be reserved for an optic. Chances for a magazine and a hop-up are lower than for other gear, and if the secret compartment is open while no one on your team has a weapon will spawn in that extra layer with 2 attachments for it. So if you want to land on an assault bin right off of drop, this can be a viable strategy. Assault legends are also able to carry more ammo per stack in their backpack inventory. This can wind up giving them extra space in their backpack for other items such as grenades. Now let's start off with Ballistic, the newest legend into the assault class at the time of the making of this video. His passive is called the Sling, where he's able to hold a 3rd weapon in his inventory, and now recently this ability got buffed so that your sling weapon will have all white attachments as well as being equipped with a 1x classic sight. These attachments cannot be removed from the sling as long as the weapon is in the 3rd slot though. His tactical, the Whistler, will shoot a smart bullet that when it hits an enemy will deal 20 damage on contact, and then depending on if the enemy shoots their weapon and for how long, it can and will overheat their weapon, pausing the use of it and dealing an additional 30 damage to the enemy. Lastly, his ultimate is called Tempest. When activated, nearby teammates get faster reloads, faster armed movement speed, and infinite ammo. And Ballistic's sling weapon will be upgraded to gold tier during this ultimate. While Ballistic might not be the strongest legend right now, he has slowly received some buffs over the last couple seasons. The playstyle that I like to use while playing as Ballistic is certainly aggressive, but I want to be tactical, particularly with my Whistler. If I can get a connection with this tactical ability on an enemy during a fight and be close enough to play off of its use, then I could probably win a quick 1v1. Now, the Whistler at times is somewhat inconsistent. It's definitely gotten better, but there will be times where you will have the yellow indicator while shooting this thing, which indicates that it should connect to the enemy, and then it might have a strange interaction with some of the map, meaning it just hits some piece of cover, never touches the enemy, and you're out your tactical for the time being. However, if you do get a successful hit with this thing, playing off of it is crucial. Remember, it's going to deal that 20 initial damage, but if you can pause their ability to shoot their weapon or force their hand to shoot a little bit and then deal an additional 30 damage, you've knocked off 50 HP right then and there in a brief window where you can output more damage to them. I would not just be using the Whistler at long distances to see if you can hinder an enemy. I want to do it up close, and I want to play off of what happens when an enemy gets hit by it. The better you can get at this, the better you will be with Ballistic. Now, when it comes to timing his ultimate, you really just want to keep it simple and focus on, are we about to get into a fight? And if the answer is yes, pop it. This thing's on a pretty short cooldown. It's going to last 30 seconds, and for every knock you get in it, you will get rewarded additional time. Assists will also count to boosting the time. But this ultimate just straight up enhances your gunplay. It's going to make everything a little bit smoother and a little bit easier. Not to mention, you're going to have 3 weapons, and 1 will be fully kitted gold. Any ability like Ballistics or Bloodhounds or even Revenants, where there's this 30-second time duration, you just want to make sure you're getting the timing down. If you're about to get into a fight, but you still have to run 20 meters before you're about to enter that doorway where you believe the enemies to be are, you don't want to pop the ultimate too early, because by the time you get to that doorway, you could already have shaved off 50% of the time on the ultimate. You want to think about using it when you're really close to the enemies, but not so close that you're doing the animation where your gun isn't out. That's the middle ground that you're going to want to find here. And also keep in mind, this benefits your teammates too. So even if you're approaching, you take some damage, but your teammates are going in on the fight, maybe pop the ultimate before you go and pop a shield battery when you're not necessarily in the fight, because you're going to help your teammates out here too. The times I've found the most success with Ballistic is when I've been aggressive and I've gotten up in the face of my opponents while combining my tactical and my ultimate strategically. Some of the best weapons to put in the third slot are weapons like the Havoc or the Devotion, or maybe even the Alternator, Ari, Mozambique, all because they will get that additional hop up to the weapon, which makes them even more overpowered. Obviously, the Havoc right now is really strong, and so having that turbocharger and having it being fully kitted makes this gun really scary to go up against when Ballistic is in their ultimate. And a quick tip for Ballistic's tactical is that when you're holding the tactical to get the lock on activated, sometimes, as I said, it will have a weird interaction with the map or the world around you. But if the enemy is behind some piece of cover, or if the enemy is on a little bit more elevation than where you are, once you get the yellow indication that you've locked on, you can tilt the Whistler up and shoot it at an angle so that it creates this diagonal shot, and it can end up connecting to the enemy around or over a piece of cover. Now, this isn't always going to work, but it can work when the enemy is utilizing some form of cover, and it may be a better way to use the tactical than just trying to connect to them directly straight on when maybe not much of their hitbox is showing. And if you are playing with friends and you guys are on comms, be sure to communicate when you connect with this tactical, because even if you aren't able to play off of what it's doing, if your teammates can, it will just benefit your squad altogether. Moving on to Ash, she is the one and only legend in the assault class that has a movement ability that's part of her kit. Her passive Marked for Death allows for her to see recent death boxes on the map and mark them for her teammates, as well as manually marking the death box to see if there is any surviving attackers and where they currently are. It's not a very helpful passive these days, but maybe that will change in the future. Her tactical, the Arc Snare, throws a spinning snare that deals 20 damage and tethers the first enemy who gets too close. This will hinder the enemy's movement for a few seconds. And her ultimate, the Phase Breach, tears a one-way portal to a targeted destination. Now, a few quick notes on Ash. She is one of the weakest legends in the game currently. Her tactical is the only tactical in her class that can't be used while healing or shooting, when all of the other assault legends can use one hand for their tactical and one hand for something else, but not Ash. Now, this doesn't make a ton of sense to me because it's a weak ability in general, but maybe this changes in the future. Regardless, for now, keep that in mind. And her portal can be decent at times, but it can have a sensitive placement. So in a rush, you may end up portaling 5 feet away instead of that building you were aiming for at 35 feet away that would have gotten you to some cover. So those are some pitfalls to look out for, but how should you play Ash? Well, I like to use Ash in aggressive manners when it comes to pushing them, especially when they may be backed up or on their heels. But I can also use her as a quick repositioning legend to get out of a dicey situation. Now, it's not as good to escape with as it can be to push an enemy, especially if you have your teammates following you and you guys are bombarding through that phase breach. Some people will say if you want to escape, use the Ash portal and then throw an arc snare at the end of the portal so that when and if an enemy takes it, they will be tethered and briefly hindered, and maybe you can get behind them and get some shots on them. While yes, this can work out at times, it's not going to be extremely useful all the time. If you just got hit for 150 but only dealt 20 damage before you tried to portal away, that player will still probably be able to get to you and end up killing you. The strongest way that I like to use Ash is using her tactical often within fights, and particularly trying to make a good read when one enemy is out of position so that I can tether them and then hopefully catch them when they don't have any cover nearby. Or on the flip side, if my team is looking to be aggressive and close the gap, I'm looking to portal to a vantage point where we're not going to get immediately fired upon when we come out of the portal, because remember, this is a one-way portal, so you don't want to get in too deep, getting into something too crazy, especially when an enemy can read that. But if you can portal to high ground, seize that high ground, and then take care of any enemy's low ground, especially with your teammates taking the portal, well, this is where Ashe has some power. Typically, I wouldn't be IGLing or leading my team on Ashe unless I'm the only legend with some sort of movement ability, but if that is the case, your team composition is probably already a little off. However, you do want to be kind of playing in that secondary fragger role as Ashe, because you're going to need to be able to make the read off of any initial damage dealt to potentially move up and portal onto that enemy team. If you're always playing in the back with Ashe, you may be doing the legend a bit of a disservice because you may not be able to make these reads and see what's happening in the fight actively to then make a better decision off how you want to capitalize on your advantage. Next legend in the assault class is Fuse. On Fuse's passive ability, Grenadier, he's able to stack an extra grenade per inventory slot. And he can also equip the grenades to his arm where he's able to fire the grenades faster, farther, and more accurately. However, keep in mind, for vertical frag grenades, I recommend not using his passive and recommend throwing them. Because of how far he's going to launch it, it will end up exploding way too high in the air before it ever has a chance to come back down. On his tactical ability, the Knuckle Cluster, he launches a cluster bomb that continuously expels air burst explosives on impact. This starts dealing damage at 5 per tick, but the longer an enemy's in it, the more damage will stack up. And then on his ultimate ability, the Motherload, he launches a bombardment that encircles a target area in a wall of flame. When enemies are inside of his ultimate, they will be highlighted for Fuse and his teammates, similar to how Bloodhound scan works. Fuse is the only legend in the game where all of his abilities center around dealing damage. He is a unique legend in that aspect, and I think I remember one of the devs who worked on Fuse early on, back around season 7 or 8, was that they kind of messed up with creating this legend because they never really wanted a legend that fully centered around dealing damage, and that affects how they can balance the legend without kind of changing how Apex gunplay and gameplay feels as a whole. So he's always sort of limited, but they have buffed him over the years, but not a lot. I would say Fuse is just in the middle of the pack. He's not really bad, but he's also not really good. And a huge reason is just that he takes a lot of damage from his abilities himself, and that can hinder him. And at times, I think players focus too much on trying to deal damage with his abilities as opposed to just using their guns. It can be sort of a distraction. Now, that's not an excuse for a bad Fuse player, but it is something you're gonna want to watch out for, because trust me, it will happen to most players. So let's talk about how to play Fuse. Well, I like to think of Fuse as more of a supportive assault legend. His abilities in most scenarios will be nice accompaniments to the gunplay of you and your squad mates. He's great at denying area and forcing enemies to move from their cover or their solid positioning. But as I said, I try not to get too focused on using his abilities to the point where I'm treating my weapons secondary to his abilities. This could also be true if I'm going in up against an enemy that hasn't taken any damage yet. In most scenarios, I want to go in with my weapon drawn because it's going to do way more damage and be much more effective most of the time than just hitting a knuckle cluster and having the enemy move while shooting me and I'm not shooting back. This sounds rather obvious when I explain it like this, but trust me, it's a really common pitfall for a lot of players that use Fuse. Keep in mind that Fuse is similar to Ashe in the way that he also can't use his tactical while shooting or healing, so you got to be able to pick one or the other here, and balancing that at times will require some awareness. Fuse is really good at breaking down doors and getting into buildings. He's a great counter to a lot of the controller legends, and also one of the underrated things I like to do with this knuckle cluster is if I'm in a spot where I can't necessarily get the thirst on an enemy to get that full elimination, but I've got one knocked, the knuckle cluster is great at preventing that enemy player from getting revived and maybe even getting that full thirst. Another common mistake that a lot of Fuse players do is they will be peeking an enemy, they take some damage, and probably they took more damage than they dealt to the enemy, and they re-peek with the knuckle cluster. Now, good players will look out for that, and they are prepared for you to re-peek with a knuckle cluster. Now, at times, this can be a viable strategy, but if you overplay your hand with this tactic, good players will know how to read you, and they will pre-aim that cover that you're about to peek from, knowing that you're about to try to use your knuckle cluster, and they will down you or get you to one shot and then just push you. Moving on to Fuse's ultimate, the Motherload. Now, this ability is pretty wonky. There will be some moments where it definitely will be helpful and maybe will even get you a knock or two, but I imagine those instances will be far outnumbered by a use case where it does practically nothing to an enemy because they either just walk out of it within the first second or two and only end up taking 5 damage, or the fire just misses them completely because it had a weird interaction with the map around you and where you wanted it to go. This thing is on a pretty short cooldown, so feel free to use it often, but do keep in mind if you are in a building, it will have a strange interaction with the roof or the ceiling. This will make it come down probably around you or right in front of you, and you could wind up taking a good amount of damage. Make sure to use Fuse's level 2 upgrade that allows for him to take 50% less damage from his ultimate, and and avoid the slowing effect from it too. Also, do keep in mind with Fuse's ultimate, enemies are highlighted while they are inside the ring of fire. So this can work if you ult a building and enemies are inside the building. It will definitely depend on what the shape of the building is, where the mother load lands, where the enemies are inside of it, but this can give you a rough layout of where the enemies are if you ult outside of the building and you get a quick glimpse into where the enemies are inside the building. But I think the best use case with this ability is really when enemies are already confined on space or healing because they took a good amount of damage. Using this to surround the enemies while they can't just run out of the cover that they're using because they're already low is the best use case. You will force them to make a bad decision either way, and if you can complement his ultimate with his tactical, the use of his passive with grenades, and or you and your teammates gunfire, you will probably end up catching them in a spot where they really can just do nothing. As I said, this is not the strongest ability to use, but do keep in mind you can also zoom in with the ultimate so that you're more accurate with the placement of it. You can also use it to zoom in and see places around you so that you can kind of get a lay of the land of where enemies are at a farther distance. It's a very niche use case, but definitely try it out. The next legend in the assault class is Bangalore. On Bangalore's passive, the double time, while taking fire and while sprinting, she will move faster for a brief time. Her tactical ability is called the smoke launcher. She'll fire a high velocity smoke canister that explodes into a smoke wall on impact. And her ultimate ability, Rolling Thunder, she will call in an artillery airstrike that slowly creeps across the landscape. This is in a 6x6 formation and covers a pretty large amount of space. Bangalore is the most recent assault legend to receive some of the biggest nerfs in the game, and that is because she has been meta for, well, a few seasons now, and they wanted to take her down a notch. So most recently, her smokes and her ultimate got pretty heavily nerfed. The smokes will no longer deal damage upon impact, it won't last as long, there'll be a longer cooldown on them, and there's also a longer cooldown on her ultimate. That's just the brief version. If you want to learn more about it, I covered it in a previous video, or you can check out the patch notes. But let's get into some of the best ways to utilize Bangalore. Bangalore is a very well-rounded legend despite her nerfs. She serves as a flexible pick among her peers due to the multifaceted ways her abilities can be used. She certainly can be an aggressive legend, or she can be a master at disengaging. Cutting off lines of sight can be helpful with rotating, buying some extra time within a fight, mitigating a player's power position while you're in the open, things like that. But more so now than ever, timing her abilities will be everything. Her passive is something that will trigger, as I said, when enemies are aiming or shooting at her, and so you can utilize this while you are trying to cross from point A to point B, and you already know an enemy is looking at you with their weapon. Her tactical has many different use cases, so it's going to be tough to cover every single way that you want to use it, but a lot of Bangalore screw up by smoking them or their teammates when they actually had an edge over the enemies. You want to think about smoking yourself when you need cover, when you've taken damage, but not when you've dealt more damage to your enemies and you should be looking to posture up and maybe even secure a knock off that damage. If you are moving throughout the map and you notice that an enemy player has a good power position over you and your squad mates, smoking them is a viable strategy because then that allows their position to not be as strong and gives you the safety net of hopefully rotating from that point A to point B position. The fact that her smokes don't last nearly as long now puts a lot more emphasis on timing this correctly. Of course, you're going to need to be accurate with the smoke placement, but you don't want to be thinking about just spamming the smokes as you may have previously done. They are only going to last for 11 seconds now, and that's down from 18. That's a huge difference to deal with. When you're confined on space, you can definitely smoke yourself to buy you some space and time to hopefully pop that shield battery and then come out of the smoke to see if that enemy is pushing into your smoke. With the nerf of digital threats as well, it's tougher to use the smoke as this combat tool where you're able to fight it. Of course, digital threats can still go on pistols and shotguns, but they are not as common as they were even last season. So fighting has also changed in and around the smoke. Whenever possible, I still think it's a viable strategy to run a digital threat if you choose to run one of those weapons that could take it, but don't hinder yourself to just choose one of the weaker weapons to fight in the smoke when you could have a better weapon and you may only fight in the smoke once per match, if that. One of the best strategies that good players like to use is acknowledging when one enemy player is playing a split angle and noticing that they can smoke the player who's got the split angle and have them and their team push the other two who are probably in a more easier spot to get to. Smoking that player who's who's got the split angle allows for their angle to just be completely removed from the fight, forces them to move, which may put them in a worse spot than where they previously were, and it also just prevents them from affecting the 3-man pushing their duo. Great players love to utilize this strategy, so even when you're on the flip side of this situation and you're fighting a Bangalore, try to recognize it when it's happening. Now, when it comes to the Rolling Thunder, Bangalore's ultimate is now on a 4.5-minute cooldown. Now, her level 2 upgrade can reduce this by 60 seconds, bringing it to 3.5 minutes, which is definitely something you're going to want to consider going with, since it really will allow for you to have this ability much more often throughout the match. But nonetheless, this ability was initially developed so that you could throw it down and push through it and basically affect any enemies who decided to linger in it, or push the enemies back so that you were able to close the gap to them. I wouldn't say that's how it's most often used these days, since you can get hit by it, your teammates can get hit by it, and while your teammates won't take damage, they'll certainly get stunned and slowed. And that's really the biggest thing that players want to avoid when there's a Bangalore ultimate. That slowing and stunning effect is brutal. So if you're playing Bangalore and you get a hit or two with the Rolling Thunder, try to capitalize within the first 5 seconds of the enemies getting hit by it. They will not be able to see you well, they will not be able to fight back well, and this will be a huge advantage that you have over them. You can use this in many different ways. You can use it while you're rotating to prevent a team from messing with you. You can use it in late game while you have a power position. You can use it if your teammate got downed and you know the enemies are pushing you, but you want to buy some more time to get the revive off. You can utilize it to breach a building because the enemy team is sitting on top of it and you want to force them off of it. There are so many use cases for this ultimate, and it's a very strong one, and it's something that a lot of players like to use. If you are using it on the offensive and you want to try to push through it, try to find those niche little pockets in between the missiles exploding where you're actually not going to get hit, because contrary to popular belief, there are often little pockets in the 6x6 formation that allow for you to avoid the damage and stunning effect from the missile on either side of you. This won't always be possible, but there are moments where it is. Okay, the last legend, and probably the most fun legend right now to use in the assault class, is Mad Maggie. Her passive ability temporarily highlights enemies that you've damaged and allows for Maggie to move faster with a shotgun. To be specific, she will run with a shotgun at the same speed she will run with her hands out. Her tactical ability, the Riot Drill, fires a drill that burns enemies through obstacles, and her ultimate ability, the Wrecking Ball, will throw a ball that releases speed boosting pads and detonates near enemies. Maggie is definitely my favorite legend right now in the assault class. I like to think of her as the ultimate fighting legend. She can provide some chaos, but she has a lot of utility that just stacks up and makes for a good time and makes for a great aggressive legend. You want to focus on up close encounters with Maggie. Obviously, the shotgun benefit is something that you're going to want to consider. This doesn't mean that you always have to run a shotgun, but she definitely benefits from it, especially given how one of her class perks allows for auto reload on knocks with shotguns. But beyond that, I think with her perk upgrades, she just got even better this season, and it makes her even more of a viable pick. When it comes to using her passive, keep in mind that this will temporarily highlight enemies regardless if you hit them with your drill, your weapon, a grenade, the Wrecking Ball, I mean anything. And this can come in handy in many different scenarios. You want to look to play off this temporary highlight because it's going to give you that extra bit of info and probably can make all the difference in you getting a knock on the enemy or not. Her Riot Drill has many different use cases, but think about eliminating the enemy's cover with it. If they're low and they're playing behind the cover, you're going to force them to make a bad decision, similar to how Fuse's abilities can be used. If you want to force them out of their beneficial cover before they've taken any damage, so that you can drill that cover and then have your weapon drawn to be ready to fire at them when they're forced to move. Both of these are viable strategies. Complement it with your gunplay, your teammates' gunplay, and also the Wrecking Ball. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time in this video talking about the legend upgrades, and mostly that is because I've talked a lot about the upgrades in previous videos. But for Maggie, I do want to touch on it. For the majority of the season, I thought going with having 2 drills, despite them not being able to go as far through things, was better. But now I've definitely settled on having big drill, which allows for 1 bigger drill. And this thing is insane. It will definitely wind up doing much more to enemies and surprise them in a lot of scenarios because they're just not used to the range of the big drill. It can eliminate so much space from an enemy and wind up doing a lot more damage, in my opinion. So I've been going with big drill, and I've been utilizing it in many different scenarios, particularly in end games and ranked, where players don't have as much space to use and they're really focused on playing around some cover. If you can get an edge with the Riot Drill, don't be afraid to move off of it. When it comes to the Wrecking Ball, this ability is also kind of wonky. There will be times where it explodes and just comes back, hits you, hits your teammates, doesn't go where you want it to, and that's just going to be the unfortunate fact of this ability. This ability will also break down a lot of other ultimates like Horizon's ultimate, Conduit's ultimate, several others as well. And this can be a great counter to when you see an enemy use one of their ultimates on you. The Wrecking Ball is on a rather short cooldown, so you can apply it to kind of just counter theirs right away. There are some niche use cases to use it for a rotational tool if you've got to get from point A to point B, but that's probably secondary to being aggressive with it, because I think using this in an aggressive manner is just much more beneficial. If an enemy or two gets hit by this thing, that slowing, stunning effect and the brief damage, along with potentially the ball being on fire so they may get burned by a thermite, can all stack up in your favor and allow for you to just play off of that, especially having the speed boost up to the point of finding them. This is just a great way to be aggressive with and play off of all of the effects that the Wrecking Ball offers, and then hopefully catch them when they're basically helpless. You do not want to take a passive approach with Mad Maggie, because you just will not be utilizing her kit to the fullest extent. This legend is meant to be played in an aggressive manner, so lean into that. And if you're just not comfortable in that playstyle, well, she's the perfect legend to get better at this with. You can lead your team on Maggie, or you can be that secondary fragger if you want, but she's great at opening fights with damage. And this is what you're going to want to do if you're playing that aggressive role, because the person who deals that first damage in the fight often knows the most about what to do next off of that damage. And Maggie has just a great kit for this role. I think you're going to see her a lot more throughout this season and probably into next season, because a lot more players are just picking up on how good she is. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see me cover one of the other legend classes, be sure to comment down below and check out this video next. Thanks for watching. Peace.